When I used to see these mowers on the side of the road being given away, I used to say, oh, it's just a cheap little mower, and besides, it's probably worn out and not fixing. Well, that was years ago, but now things have changed, and not for the better. There are so many lesser mowers flooding our shores that give a whole new meaning to cheap and unreliable. When I see these mowers for sale now, I'll go out of my way to get it because I've since realized I've been wrong all these years about owning and using a simple and reliable mower. In today's video, we're going to look at this Murray lawnmower with a Briggs engine, and the problem is that before I can confidently and safely work on it, I'd like to give it a quick cleaning, only because, let's face it, more than likely this is going to be the first time it's ever going to be washed. That means it's going to have a lot of dirt in places where it shouldn't be, like around the carb and the fuel tank. Now, is it necessary to clean it? Not at all, but it is good practice. While I clean this mower, I'm going to use the video as a background and talk about why this tiny, simple, and extremely reliable mower is something you're going to miss in the marketplace. Now, it's no surprise to those of you who have watched my past videos that I'm fighting as hard as I can to resist the urge to switch over to batteries, mainly in silent protest, but also because I know what I'm leaving behind and it's really not all that different to the future than you think. So what do I mean by that statement? Well, think about it. Batteries were supposed to give you a reliable machine that's going to work with almost none of the fuss. Now, we are going to skip over the rest of the details about batteries, but the main promise was that it was going to work when you need it to. But here's the issue. This simple little mower was making the same promise decades ago, but how was that even possible? The answer is not as complicated as you would think. Oh, before I go on, I want you to notice the amount of dirt inside the throat of the carb. The reason it looks like this is because the air filter wasn't doing its job. But how is that even possible? The reason is whoever changed the air filter forgot to oil it. Foam itself won't trap dirt, so that's the reason it needs to be oiled. The filter allowed enough dirt to pass through it only to be collected by the gasoline that might be clinging to the walls of the carb. It's a good thing I didn't try and start it because otherwise I might have damaged the piston rings and the cylinder wall. Now, I'm not aware of any particular kind of oil you should use on the filter, but I would use a thin oil, which means do not use motor oil. Personally, I use any spray lubricant from a can, but anything is better than what happened to this one. They might as well have had no filter on it at all. But I will say the saving grace for this whole situation is this engine. I've never seen a better one to take this kind of abuse, and that's saying a lot. The reason is I'm not sure of a current engine that could take the same kind of abuse and keep on working. I'm not sure if it's the materials the rings are made out of or the cylinder, but I've seen these run with little to no oil, and even if it hurts the engine, it'll just end up burning some extra oil and be a little bit smoky, but it still continues to work. Now, running on low oil is one thing, but that's not the only trick this reliable engine has up its sleeve. The next reason might surprise you. One of the most underrated aspects of this entire engine is the carb and fuel tank setup. The way this fuel system works is quite brilliant. The carb is plastic, which means it's not only cheap to make, but it will not corrode like a metal one. The diaphragm pump will then pull fuel from near the bottom of the tank and bring it into a well right under the carb that basically acts like a fuel bowl. The reason it does this is because the carb needs to draw fuel from a consistent point in the tank. But why is this design so important? Simple. It boils down to avoiding bad fuel. Over time, if the fuel sits in the tank, it will begin to oxidize and its color will start to get darker. And as more time goes by, that fuel is going to start to go stale, and worse yet, it might start to evaporate to a thick and sticky varnish. Now, the best part is that bad gasoline is going to stay in the tank and will not affect the carb other than the pickup tube, which will be in contact with it. That means that most times to get this engine working again, all we have to do is drain the old fuel out of the tank, add fresh fuel, press the primer bulb a few times until you hear it spray fuel into the engine, and it should start. But why is this better than a gravity-fed carb of right now? That's pretty easy. Unless you have a fuel valve to isolate the carb, that old gasoline not only goes bad, but it does it while in full contact with the carb. Now, this constant barrage of stale gasoline will eventually damage every part of a normal metal carb. Now, this will eventually lead to pitting in the metal and damage to the softer parts of the carb, such as the seat for the needle and also the float bowl gasket. Now, you might be able to replace those two parts, but once the metal is damaged, it's difficult to gauge just how much damage there really is. Of course, I would recommend just replacing the carb instead of trying to save it, but on this design, we don't have to worry as much about it. Of course, I have seen those metal tanks get damaged as well, but then again, if you had water in the tank, it wouldn't matter which design you had. So if this design was so great, then why did they disappear? easy. They got rid of them because they started to try and make more horsepower from them. I'm not sure what the crossover point was, but if I had to guess, once the flatheads started to make well over 5 horsepower, the plastic carbs disappeared and they went back to a gravity-fed system. If you happen to know more about this change, I'd like to hear from you. The issue was that once it moved up in power, things got a bit more complicated. Since the carb didn't have to mount to the fuel tank, the tank changed from a metal one to plastic, and since the carb had to be mounted to the engine, it changed to become a metal one. Overall, the newer design was good, but it definitely was more complicated than a plastic carb on a metal fuel tank, and that's yet another reason why these little simple mowers were so good. They were easy to work on, which is something you can't say about a lot of things. In this simple design, there's also no fuel line to worry about clogging or collapsing. Working on the carb only takes a handful of minutes to get full access to, and to be honest, aside from the diaphragm for the pump, the design of this carb is simple to understand. Overall, this engine is so underrated, and it's mostly because it doesn't make a lot of power. That means most engines don't support a self-propel system. But why is that? Self-propel is just another reason to raise the price of a basic mower. It's just another item that will eventually fail. Self-propel isn't even needed for this particular mower because it's so lightweight. It simply doesn't need it. Now, I like a good self-propel system, but as long as the mower is easy to push around, I don't have an issue not having it. Just don't get in a big hurry. Unfortunately, most of what we look for when buying anything is finding something that's a good value, but that's been mutated into getting the biggest and the best. That means a mower that only makes 4 or so horsepower doesn't typically fall into that category of a good value, which is a real shame, because in my mind, this engine is the jewel of this entire mower. Now, a mower is just an engine without a good deck, so what do I have to say about this mowing deck? Surprisingly not much, but that's the best part. Now, the metal for this mowing deck is not very thick, but it works extremely well, and the best part is the fact that it's a side discharge, which means it doesn't have to worry about all the baffling, deflectors, or a special blade to do any sort of mulching or even bagging. So how does that make this mowing deck work so well with this engine? Yet again, it goes back to simplicity. Without all the extra features needed for mulching and bagging, the deck is a one-piece design which is simple and strong because it doesn't have to make all those accommodations for the extra features. So even though the deck isn't very thick, without all the extra features, it's well suited to the engine mounted to it. To put it simply, it just works. To be honest, if I didn't like my own personal mower so much, I'd gladly use one of these because that's how much I appreciate them. Now, this simple mower still does a fantastic job of cutting the grass, but my personal preference when it comes to mowers is one that mulches. But needless to say, these are great mowers, and if you get a chance to try one of these out, I think you might feel the same way. So my question is, if you saw one of these insignificant little mowers on the side of the road, would you stop and pick it up? I hope you would, if not to use, maybe out of sheer curiosity. Besides, the worst you could do is pick it up and keep it because as time goes by and more battery stuff starts showing up and overwhelming the market, you could easily sell that mower for a surprising amount of money. I know I'd buy it. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.